Hello, welcome everyone to Wilmette Institute's webinar. I'm happy to welcome you to tonight's webinar. Thank you, all of you here on a Friday night. Tonight's webinar is Social Transformation, the Evolving Challenge of Racial Inequality. This webinar is live streamed on YouTube and accessible later on various podcast platforms. We hope that you enjoy the program and will share it with others. As many of our viewers know, the Wilmette Institute is an online educational institution providing university and extension courses dedicated to the building of a new society through transformative education. Our interdisciplinary courses aim to develop the capacity of participants to contribute meaningfully to the current discourses of society, exploring both the material and spiritual dimensions of social change. Our educational endeavors, including courses, certificate programs, and webinars, inspire a commitment to social transformation, drawing upon a Baha'i conceptual framework in the areas of community building, social action, and contributing to prevalent discourses. For those who are unfamiliar with the Baha'i faith, please learn more at baha'i.org for the international site and baha'i.us for the US site. Before we get started, I have an announcement for our upcoming courses, the fall courses for our Social Transformation Certificate Program. I encourage any of you who are interested to really consider it. It is a unique tuition-free program that combines theory and practice for participants to basically be accompanied on their path to contribute meaningfully to social change. The next two online courses starting in August are, one of them is about sustainability. The title is Sweeping Changes in Humanity's Relationship with the Natural World. And the second one is on social change, which is called Catalysts of Social Change, Knowledge, Action, and Impact. The application deadline is July 21st. Basically, it is a one-year graduate level program. You have to either have a bachelor's degree or be a student enrolled in an undergraduate program at the junior or senior level. Some may ask, how is this amazing program free? It is so because the participants provide meaningful feedback on the program, and this is how we are basically rolling out our certificate program. So I really encourage anyone interested to apply. Please see our website for more information. Now I have the pleasure to introduce my co-host for today's webinar, Asia Robinson. She is a student, a graduate student at North Carolina Central University, who we are partnering with. And we just piloted our first course, our first graduate course, Reconstructing Blackness. And I have to say, Asia is one of those students that any faculty member will want to say she was in my class. Because she just gives she gives her 100%. So I'm going to ask Asia to also introduce herself with more details.
Good evening, everyone. And Dr. Golestani, I want to thank you for that great introduction. But before we begin, I'd like to take some time just to introduce myself. Like Dr. Golestani said, my name is Asia Robinson. I'm currently a graduate student in the master's program of criminal justice at the illustrious North Carolina Central University. I recently had an amazing opportunity to participate in Dr. Golestani's course called Reconstructing Blackness, where we were able to really take a deep dive and engage with the legacy of structural racism and really figuring out what that looks like. And I was able to take it through a lens of the school to prison pipeline. This experience really aligns deeply with my long-term goals of working at the intersections of law, racial justice, and community empowerment. And so it also resonates with the values reflected in today's conversation, which we'll get into very shortly, particularly the Baha'i teachings on unity, justice, and just inherent dignity of every human being. That's why I'm super excited and I'm very, very honored to be able to co host tonight's event and be in discussion with Dr. June Manning Thomas, whose work has long inspired this type of transformative type of vision. So, thank you all. I'm excited for tonight.
Thank you so much, Asia. Really appreciate you being here. And you're very gracious. I was a help to Dr. Agbenyega in the course. But again, so happy to be there. Now, without further ado, we have the pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. Um, she is a person I have admired for decades, and it is an honor, really, to be able to have this conversation and to have had her be a guest speaker in our course at NCCU as well. So many of you know Dr. June Manning Thomas is Professor Emerita of Urban Planning at the University of Michigan and a member of the National Spiritual Assembly of the U.S. She writes on post-industrial cities, planning theory, and racial justice. In 2023, she received the Distinguished Educator Award for Lifetime Achievement. Her most cited book is Redevelopment and Race, which won the 1999 Paul Davidoff Award. She also co-edited Urban Planning and the African American Community, 1996, and authored Planning Progress, Lessons from Shoghi Effendi, also 1999, second edition, 2024. Her latest book, Struggling to Learn, 2021, is a history and memoir of school desegregation in South Carolina. She taught planning history and theory, mentoring students in community development projects in Detroit and beyond. Welcome, Dr. Thomas. We are very, very happy to have you with us tonight.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for asking me to be here. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to offer a few thoughts on racial inequality and social transformation. And for that purpose, I've created a PowerPoint that I will now proceed to pull up. So when I was asked to give some remarks, I thought it might be useful to just think through this concept of social transformation. We're undergoing so many changes now in this nation that this seems to be an apt topic for us to think about. And so, what should we think about? One of the things is just what were the strategies for social transformation related to racial inequality 50 or 60 years ago? And then what are the prospects for today in 2025? How might we foresee social transformation that can bring about the unity of humanity of all races, starting with this country and then the world? So the format for tonight is I'll offer a few slides, excuse me, a few thoughts about these questions. And then we have the two hosts who will be asking me a few questions. And then that will be more open commentary. And then we have the opportunity for the audience to ask certain questions. So, of course, the civil rights era is something that most of us are familiar with. It seems very appropriate to think about what was happening then and to think about what social transformation took place. The civil rights era quite often is defined as sometime between 1954 and 1964, although some take that up to 1968. And that has become almost a heroic era in people's minds, in large part because of the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, pictured here. But the social transformation actually depended on thousands for millions of people who were active and carrying out certain actions in hundreds, if not thousands, of places. At that time, the possibilities for transformative social change seemed to be very palpable. I lived during that era, and I remember very well that people really thought that this was going to transform American society for the better, and in some ways it did. I found this quotation very helpful. This is from Baha'u'llah, and it says, "Every age hath its own problem, and every soul its particular aspiration. The remedy the world needeth in its present day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements." So I think we could truthfully say that the people of that time were anxiously concerned with the needs of that time, and they arose to meet those needs using various strategies in various ways. Most of the photographs that I'm showing in this portion are from my hometown of Orangeburg, South Carolina. That is Martin Luther King in the middle of this photograph. And the person on the left is my father, who was hosting him on that day as he visited one of the two colleges in our town, which was Claflin College. Of course, while what we think of as civil rights activism was taking place, that is, the marching, the demonstrations, the legal work, the Baha'is were undertaking their own efforts to work on racial unity. And they were doing that inspired in part by quotations such as this one from Baha'u'llah. "O children of men, know ye not why we created you all from the same dust, that no one should exalt himself over the other. Ponder at all times in your hearts how ye were created. Since we have created you all from one same substance, it is incumbent on you to be even as one soul, to walk with the same feet, eat with the same mouth, and dwell in the same land." I've always loved this passage because it describes not only this desire that we as human beings should see ourselves as so close as to be one soul, but it even talks about us walking with the same feet, eating with the same mouth, and dwelling in the same land. And what struck me in particular when I first read this was that for many people, especially in certain regions of this country, even eating together, the races eating together was considered to be social taboo. And that was the way it was in South Carolina until I was well into my teenage years. And then, of course, we do not dwell in the same land. We still experience a great deal of residential segregation. So I've always thought that this quotation encapsulizes the vision that Baha'u'llah had for social transformation as it relates to racial unity. This photograph is of the Baha'is in Greenville, South Carolina, which was about 2 hours away from my hometown. And even in the early years, 1920s and 1930s, the Baha'is were holding interracial meetings. They were meeting in each other's homes. They were forming friendships. And this photograph from 1962 is indicative of the kinds of community that they were trying to create at that time. Of course, if we look more recently, if we look at a more recent era, we see in more recent years that people are also carrying out demonstrations designed to protest certain injustices. In this particular case, excessive police force used against Black citizens. This focus on police force arose in part because of the increasing documentation by bystanders with their cell phones. This brought to the attention of a wide swath of citizenry the kind of mistreatment that many Black people had been experiencing firsthand for many years. What was particularly noteworthy was that many of these demonstrators included several races of people who were marching in support of what they tagged in shorthand, Black Lives Matter, even to the point that such signs sprang up on many suburban lawns in all kinds of neighborhoods, white, Black, and painted on city streets. As we watch the fading popular and governmental support for this particular movement, we are forced to consider the reality of racial inequality in other spheres of life. So the next 3 slides summarize some of those other inequalities. So this one, wealth gaps by race and ethnicity. This comes from the Urban Institute, and it shows the blue line, which is average family wealth for people that we call white in this country. And so that family wealth includes not only income, but also savings, retirement plans, the value of homes. And we see, of course, that much farther down, we see the average household wealth of Hispanics and Blacks. The reason I'm showing this particular image is that there are some theorists, including those who argue for Black reparations, who argue that this particular graphic, this measurement, the difference between average white family wealth and average Black family wealth, is the strongest indicator of the cumulative effect of decades of racial prejudice, discrimination, oppression, and of course the byproducts of enslavement. But it's a little misleading because we know that wealth is skewed. And so there are many white families who do have over $1 million in their wealth, but we know that there are many more that don't. And so I'm including a second chart because I think this is a more realistic indication of wealth by race. And this also comes from the Urban Institute. And it shows the top line, which shows that between 65 and 70% of white families own their own home, whereas you see that the number is much far different. The lowest line, which is the gold line, is African American or Black households. And this is important because, at least in this country, home ownership is an important builder of wealth. Many people are not able to save or to invest in a way that can enhance their own family wealth to any significant degree. But an investment in home ownership is one way to build up that wealth. But we have a history of discrimination in the housing market that means that certain minorities never actually got a fair chance to get into the home ownership market because of federal policies. And so I think this is an indication of the continued inequality by race that many people may not be aware of. And then the last chart that I wanted to just show is also indicative of the kind of racial inequality that we have today. And that's segregation, racial segregation in certain neighborhoods. So what this particular chart shows for certain cities is what is, according to the orange line, the percentage of a particular metropolitan area that is Black population. And then the blue line is what is the Black percentage of Black resident neighborhoods. And so if you look at Chicago, for example, you see that Chicago African Americans make up 16% of the metropolitan areas, but but in terms of the neighborhoods that they live in, they tend to be 62% of the population. And you see for Detroit, there's even more of a concentration of of residents within certain majority African American neighborhoods. This in itself would not be a problem, except that that is associated with lack of access to certain goods, certain public goods, public schools, jobs, access to transportation, and environmental problems tend to be worse in many high minority neighborhoods. So these three charts are just sort of an indication that we are not post-racial in the sense that there still is racial inequality in America today. So we have several guiding letters from the Universal House of Justice, which is the governing body of the Baha'is of the world, that are very useful in terms of helping us to understand what does social transformation look like today. So this particular letter, which was from July 22nd, 2020, which was about 2 months after the slaying of George Floyd, which is one of the more famous police brutality cases. So this letter said, "A moment of historic portent has arrived for your nation as the conscience of its citizenry has stirred." And you'll remember I mentioned that people were marching, multiracial groups of people were marching in the streets in support of Black Lives Matter in that year. So the conscience of your citizenry has stirred with the potential to free the United States from the pernicious effects of racial prejudice. So again, the House of Justice is seeing that as a positive sign. But then they go on to say, sadly, however, your nation's history reveals that any significant progress toward racial equality has invariably been met by countervailing processes, overt or covert, that serve to undermine the advances achieved and to reconstitute the forces of oppression by other means. So, of course, those of you who know American history to any extent will realize that they're referring to the fact that at certain points in America's history, there seemed to be progress, and then there was retrenchment. I'm thinking all the way back to the Civil War and Reconstruction to follow, and then the decline of Reconstruction. I'm thinking back to, if we go all the way up to the 1954 Supreme Court decision, and yet there was retrenchment after Brown v.S. Board of Education. So they're just pointing out that in this country, we tend to make progress, which they seem to be associating with the summer of 2020. But then we witness countervailing processes that negate that progress. But they go on to remind us that racism is a profound deviation from the standard of true morality. It deprives a portion of humanity of the opportunity to cultivate and express the full range of their capability and to live a meaningful and flourishing life while blighting the progress of the rest of humankind. So this is actually a wonderful letter, and it has much in it. I don't think we can go through all of it. These are just passages. But I think what it shows is just the confirmation that racism is something that we really should work against, that it blights human progress and that it stifles the advancement of individuals as well. Again, while we had social protests and efforts of many kinds, I used only Black Lives Matter as one example, but have been efforts of many kinds to enhance racial justice and racial equality. At the same time, the Baha'i faith continued its own racial unity efforts, which included, as in that photograph I showed of 1962 Greenville, and it included building multiracial communities, but it also included seizing other opportunities, which is referenced in that July message. So Baha'is have been seizing opportunities to do all kinds of things. We have been offering courses and workshops on racial unity. We have founded organizations dedicated to racial unity and racial amity. We've sponsored race amity picnics and race unity days. We've offered declarations to leaders of thought. We've been working on this for quite a few years, for most of the 20th century and well into this century. But they go on to say in several other guidance, letters of guidance, that we have to also think of additional ways of setting in motion constructive processes that are necessary. The methods and instruments of the plan allow every soul to contribute a share of what humanity needs in this day. Far from offering a temporary salve for the ills of the moment, the prosecution of the plan is the means by which long-term constructive processes unfolding over generations are being set in motion in every society. So what do they mean by that? Well, Baha'is have been working on several strategies that are part of what the House of Justice is referencing when it refers to the plan. For example, in some neighborhoods in my own state, in Michigan, in Flint, Michigan, for example, we have several Baha'is who have been working for some years in certain neighborhoods to help educate the children and youth who have been left behind as people have fled the city of Flint because of various deindustrialization tendencies as well as water problems. So we've been organizing efforts for neighborhood children from ages 5 to 11 and for junior youth ages 11 to 14, not only in Flint, not only in Michigan, but all over the country and all over the world. In terms of this country, we now have over 2,200 groups of children's classes and junior youth groups, which are meeting in various cities, towns, and rural areas. And we're teaching them to become better human beings, more loving of their fellow brothers and sisters, and aware of the need to exhibit positive virtues in their lives. Similar efforts for teenagers and for adults are affecting even more people in this country. And that particular information comes from the annual report of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. Just one more quote I think would really be helpful, and this is also from the Universal House of Justice. And this refers to this process of trying to create a better future for humanity, but particularly for this country. We wish to stress that historically and now, social action and efforts to participate in the prevalent discourses of society have emerged not only in the context of growth, but also as a result of individual Baha'is striving to contribute to society's progress in ways available to them. As a personal response to Baha'u'llah's summons to work for the betterment of the world, believers have variously chosen to adopt certain vocations and have sought out opportunities to support the activities of like-minded groups and organizations. And I picked this quote because I was so happy when I saw this particular letter in 2021, because it showed, it kind of confirmed that, yes, we're doing all these things that I mentioned, the activities, educational activities for children, for junior youth, and for adults. But we're also undertaking social action in many of these same places, these thousands of places. And we're participating in prevalent discourses of society. Discourse is essentially just the dialogue about certain issues. So the dialogue, the national dialogue about race unity is underway, and can we essentially insert our own individual perspectives in terms of helping us to understand that? And that's kind of how I see the work I've been doing in my profession. It's been to kind of take this tack of for my own vocation and for my own profession and for my own writings to participate in the broader discourses of society in terms of how we can create a better world in terms of racial unity. And so most of my career work has been spent working with neighborhoods and working with cities to help create the kinds of social reform that we know will lead to a better society and a better civilization. This particular image is, of course, the city that I've worked with most closely, which is Detroit. And the left and right are photographs I took at some of the neighborhoods that I worked with. This is another photograph from one of the neighborhoods that my students and I worked with to try to assist them to envision what is it that you'd like to see in terms of improving this neighborhood, which is a typical approach for redevelopment urban planners. And this neighborhood I love in particular because they have tried and managed to remain interracial within the city of Detroit, even though there is a rampant process of racial segregation in residential facilities. So those are just some opening thoughts, and I hope those are helpful to open the dialogue.
Thank you so much for those opening thoughts. Now I think we will transition to hearing about your lived experience and your struggle in creating a more equitable society. Starting in the mid 60s, at the heart of the civil rights movement, for those in this country who were really concerned with racial equality, why was that such a time of hope?
So the 1960s was actually the first evidence that we could actually see of social transformation in terms of the most virulent form of racial prejudice and oppression. And of course, until that time, there was legal oppression of people of color in my own home state, in my own home region of the South. This took the form of what we call Jim Crow laws, which prohibited access to certain public facilities and that essentially forbade mixed race schools. I mean, it was written into the state constitutions. So we began to see those things crumble a bit in the 1960s, and we began to see the first glimmers, the first potential of moving past that stage.
I think you had shown us at some point a picture of your home church.
Yes, if you could pull that up. Yeah, so I'm sure that picture is coming soon, but one of the remarkable things that happened to me in my life is that I was born and raised in a small town that was very active in the civil rights movement, to the point that my home church was the headquarters for the local NAACP and for the civil rights protesters. And so some of my earliest memories are of the civil rights rallies that took place and when I was a junior youth, that age, between 10 or 11 and 14. And we do have a photograph of that hopefully will come up soon that shows my church. Civil
And
rights.
I think you had shared at our class at NCCU that your parents were also activists, right? That you were surrounded by people who were working towards something.
Yeah, I'm careful where I say that because my parents were almost silent activists. They managed to be under the radar. But they did things that only they could do, we had more obvious civil rights leaders, the guys who actually led the marches and the guys who actually went to jail. But my parents did what they could do. My dad actually offered tangible support in many ways to the civil rights protesters. He was the president of a college, Claflin College, where
Mhm.
where many of them went to school, and he went to jail to make sure they were okay. He offered facilities on campus for them to meet. He supported the NAACP, and
Mm.
he sent me to integrate the local school system. Yes, so this is my church. This is my, which is the headquarters, and this was a typical civil rights rally. So this would not have been Sunday morning. This would have been one of the weekday civil rights rallies that were headquartered in our church. And so these people would have been college students from the two Black colleges, Claflin College and also South Carolina State. But also I recognized several of my high school and junior high friends sitting on the front row. Um,
Mm.
and that's what we did. That's what our life was like when I was that age.
Wow.
As a scholar, having the opportunity to get to read your book, Struggling to Learn, I feel as though it was really clear, and you did a great job making it super clear, that the 60s weren't just about new laws, but we were exposed to families that are now having to step into the unknown, like children, middle schoolers having to do this journey and carry this journey on their own. And I think about myself as a former educator who taught seventh graders, like, to imagine them having to be put in this situation is heavy. And students were navigating fear and courage each and every day. And I really feel like your story shows us what real transformation looks like. It's not just political, but it's deeply personal. It's deeper than having access. It's about having that belonging and that courage and that dignity. And so, kind of segueing into your book, you've written a book that centers on your own experiences as a child and teenager growing up in a legally segregated South Carolina. Why did you revisit that period in your most recent writings? And what did you learn about social transformation in your hometown and in your home state?
Yeah, well, it was just, as I mentioned, an extraordinary time. And I always knew that I should write about it. I'm a writer. I mean, I'm a professor and an educator, but I actually love writing. It really is what I do when I'm stressed, is I go write something. And so I always knew I wanted to write about this, but it just there it wasn't timely. I think I had to live a little bit. I had to give it some distance. It was a fairly traumatic period of my life. And so to have to go back and revisit that period, it took a certain amount of courage. I think what actually prompted me was, first of all, just some concern that some of those stories were being lost. Um,
Mhm.
the idea that if we didn't tell those stories, things were getting flattened. People were talking about heroes, but they weren't understanding these small towns, how this so transformed the people who could finally see themselves causing social change. So the humble people you saw in that photograph of my church were forcing the nation to change, and that was a heady time. People were discovering a new sense of pride and agency, to rise up against an unjust system and to force the system to change. So I wanted to tell that story, and also tell a little bit of um my own journey to redemption. Like, how did I come out of that? How did my classmates come out of that? How did we manage to survive and move on in life? So that's what I was trying to do in that book.
And I think that there were some pictures with that too. I don't know if this look,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So that's the book cover, and then just so people understand, the top of the book cover is essentially those of us who were sent into the local, the ones shown were sent into high school and junior high. And this one, you can go to the next slide. The bottom is the back. You see the back of the police officer, and you see on the right the two men with helmets. Those were firemen, and the people behind the fence had been arrested. This is the yard of the jailhouse. And these were students from the two colleges who were essentially arrested because they were told they were picketing without a license. And the firemen were there because a common tactic in my hometown, especially at the beginning of the 1960 through 65 period. So this would have been maybe 1961 or 62. I have the date somewhere, but it would have been something like 1962. They would turn fire hoses on the students, even if it was cold outside. So there were other incidents where they beat students, arrested them. And some of the students were my age. They were, some of them, seventh and eighth graders. Several of my friends were going to jail during that period of time because we were essentially rising up against an oppressive system through peaceful picketing. But even peaceful picketing was considered to be unacceptable to the local power structure.
You know, as Asia was sharing, being a middle school educator, and you had mentioned our junior youth groups, we've all worked with young people, and to imagine that you were a teenager moving from school that was legally segregated by race to one that was forcibly desegregated by court order. How did you navigate that? What impact did that have on your spiritual journey and who you are as a person today?
Yeah, well, that could take an hour, but the time frame that we have, yeah, it was there were several things that allowed us to survive that situation. And one of them was quite simply that we were part of the movement. The our families had put us forth in great faith as warriors for the civil rights movement. And at that stage, the only way certain advances were going to get made would be we had to test the issue. So in 1954 and 55, the Supreme Court had ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation in schools was illegal, and then the South just ignored it. So 10 years later, well, before that, between 54 and the mid 60s, the NAACP started filing suit, but they needed plaintiffs. So our parents became plaintiffs, and we were the front line. So we knew that, we were conscious of that. It was a badge of honor that we were chosen to help carry that particular burden. So that was part of it. But one of the challenges was, even though we saw ourselves as civil rights warriors, we were strongly disappointed in our white classmates and white faculty members because we have been raised as very strong Christians. That church that I showed the picture of, I went to that church every Sunday. And these are the warriors. This particular evening was an evening in the spring of 1964. These were the children of the families that had agreed to send their children to desegregate the very hostile local white public schools. I'm standing there in the striped dress, and several of my friends are there. And to the far, far right is my dad standing with my baby sister. He's a small person, but each of these people was special, and carried herself or himself with great dignity and forbearance within these hostile school environments. And but we were disappointed. We were all raised in various Christian churches. We had been taught how you're supposed to treat people, and we were just appalled that we were being harassed, spit at, physically attacked by Christians, white Christians. And so it was necessary to divide, to realize that there was a division between the Christian religion and concept and theology and the way these people were acting. But it did raise certain concerns. You began to wonder, well, is every religion like this? Should I be, considering other kinds of religion? It was actually after my 12th grade year, when I was standing outside of that same church, that I met my first Baha'i. And I just said to him, I don't understand why these people are so mean to us, because we were still being harassed after 3 years I was in that school. And he said, oh, you should investigate the Baha'i faith. And I said, what's that? So that was my first introduction to the Baha'i faith, which is part of the story I wanted to tell in this book. This is the state that my life was in when I first heard about the Baha'i faith. And I wanted to tell that story, that things were so bad. And yet here was this community that was meeting interracially, that people, Black and white people, seemed to be friends, that had scripture that said that you should not be racially prejudiced. So it built on my Christian concepts, and it built on my Christian faith, which is still there. But it helped to give me access to a faith that was more forthright in terms of support for racial equality and lack of racial prejudice. That's a long answer. I hope that.
No, and it really highlights the importance of balancing spiritual and material approaches, both dimensions to social change. So in this particular case, you have the top-down law basically saying that schools need to be desegregated. And then you have an entire population just ignoring it because their hearts have not been changed.
Absolutely.
And so sometimes I'll be, so candid to say that some of my activist friends may say, well, what are you actually doing? Because you can't measure how many hearts have changed this year. It's
Right.
it's more like how many policies have been changed, right?
Yes.
But policies are not the panacea. They have to be met with hearts that are willing.
Yes.
And so
And we found that out. Yes.
Yes.
We found
Yes.
that out. And that's the countervailing forces. The countervailing forces are the unchanged hearts that come back with renewed expressions of prejudice and oppression. So yes, we do need to figure out how can we create true social transformation of hearts and minds and society at large.
Because racism is a spiritual disease.
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
And I really do think that you blended the world of academia and spirituality beautifully. The decision that you made to share your story, not just academically, but spiritually, is such a profound act of courage. And it really reminds us that truth doesn't just live in one space, it moves across platforms and disciplines and audiences. And really, by anchoring your lived experiences in both historical analysis and that spiritual lens through the Baha'i faith, you offer a more complete understanding of what injustice really is at the core and at the root. And then also, with that funneling of faith, it gives us that pathway towards healing, towards real transformation. So I think you did that beautifully.
I'm going to pay you. Can I pay you? I want you to travel with me.
But seriously, and even when we see it in your new chapter. So the separate book chapter, reconsidering the civil rights movement, right? And you revisit the civil rights era and reform in the light of Baha'i teachings. Why did you suggest the efforts to gain equal voting rights and to open up public accommodations were kind of incomplete strategies?
Mhm.
And then would you consider that the court ordered school desegregation was also another like kind of incomplete strategy?
Yeah. Yeah, so once I started writing about the civil rights era, and of course, I think it's important to say this is not my major academic area. So I was reaching a little beyond, but then I caught the bug. And once I started writing about the civil rights era, my curiosity was stoked because there were other things happening as well as school desegregation. And some of them touched my life. And one of them was, of course, the Voting Rights Act. And so I was, as a teenager, that was one of my summer jobs to work on voter registration in my hometown. And so I was very interested in how did that do? Did that do better than school desegregation did? Because now, of course, we're resegregating. So, and also public accommodations. So public accommodations means that I can now sit anywhere on a train or a bus, and I can go in the movie theater and sit any place. But it also seemed to have some incomplete reforms. So, for example, with the Voting Rights Act, when I started researching for that chapter, I was curious, did this particular movement, which supposedly culminated in the Voting Rights Act of 1965, did it really remove the obstacles to full citizenry for minority groups in this country? And so that was actually a little bit of a sad research journey because I went through and just traced the history of what happened to that Voting Rights Act of 1965. And what happened was that essentially just what the House of Justice said, countervailing forces. And so in places like South Carolina and Mississippi and other states, basically what was done were a series of strategies to make sure that the Black vote did not actually wield power. And this was done through gerrymandering, setting up certain districts, or through changing things that used to be decided through votes, instead making those executive decisions, or just essentially making it hard to get to the polls. We saw that in Georgia with recent elections. You close certain polling places and you can't vote. So what I do in that chapter is to essentially look at what are some other ways of thinking about voting rights. And so I talked about the Baha'i approach to voting is that this is something that should be available to everyone, that this is a privilege as well as a responsibility. And if anything, we should make sure that minorities are over included rather than under included. So we're told to make sure that there's a minority presence, if possible, on committees, on assemblies, on our governing bodies, which is the exact opposite of what we see now. And so I won't go into the public accommodations except to just say one thing, and that is you can walk in many restaurants in mixed race communities and not see any people of color because of the economic distress. So there you go, in terms of how successful that was. And in terms of school desegregation, the latest research shows that we have resegregated, that basically the public schools, particularly in suburban areas, are just as segregated as they were in the 1950s. And this is because public schools are so associated with residential areas, and residential areas are segregated. So yeah, it was just like an effort to kind of figure out, okay, what did happen? You know, did this particular effort at social transformation, you know, because those were pivotal efforts for the civil rights movement, you know, this idea of looking at voting rights, school desegregation, public accommodation, those were all pillars of the civil rights movement. And yet we see that they could be undermined, and they have been undermined, which makes us think, well, what are some other ways that we can think about social transformation?
So, I mean, maybe specifically about residential segregation and schooling and so forth, whichever, however you would like to address this question. Being a Baha'i and, you know, having studied the teachings, what would you say is the Baha'i perspective of social transformation that's lasting, especially in a society that has been engineered to be segregated?
Yeah, you know, first of all, um, I have to give a disclaimer. I'm not the person who decides.
True.
You know, I know that that's one of the things I said we would talk about, but I have to just preface this by saying that no one person really knows this. But what helps me is that I do have this guidance. You know, I have this moral guidance because of my belief system, and I find that that makes a lot of sense to me. And the house of the so that would be the universal house of justice in this particular era, and that basically says that we can see consequential reform of the social order. You know, that's a phrase that they use. It is possible to see consequential reform of the social order. And this is going to take effort. It will take time, but it is a worthwhile goal to have. I think some people are disappointed because they think of the times of the heyday of the civil rights movement, and they think if people aren't marching in the streets or if new laws aren't being passed, then we aren't moving forward. But that's a self-defeating perspective, because then you're kind of dead in the water if you don't see the demonstrations, or if you don't see the kinds of laws passed, or if you see laws passed that you don't like, you know, if you see policies that are being established that seem to be threatening. But if you have an alternative way of looking at the world, which is what we Baha'is are trying to cultivate, then you are looking rather at what are the long-term prospects for social transformation, and how can we start that long-term process at both the community level, or well, three, at the society level, the community level, and the individual level. So so I remember I was talking to your class, Asia, and I was asking you, well, you know, you were beginning to talk about policies. You remember someone asked me about what I thought about this federal policy or that federal policy, and I wasn't prepared for that, but out of the blue, it just came to me to say, well, what are you planning to do with your life? You know, what is your bucket? What are you planning to do in terms of carrying out the movement that's needed towards social transformation? Baha'is cultivate this by thinking about what we call a twofold moral purpose. You know,
Asia knows all about that.
okay. So the twofold moral purpose, in many religious communities, the thought is that your major task is to perfect yourself, to work on your own moral development. In Baha'i ethos, you have a twofold task: to work on yourself and your own moral development, but also to help create a better society. And we do that in several ways. Some of the ways that I mentioned in terms of the thousands of activities that we're carrying out in this country, and also in terms of the vocations that we're choosing, the things that we choose to do with our free time, the neighborhoods that we're building networks among, the friendships that we're forming. These are part of a long-term strategy of social transformation that will move not only laws and institutions, but also communities and hearts. So the problem is that people have been trying to do this through techniques that can't actually assure us of the kind of transformation, the kind of social transformation that we really would like to see. So that's my very poor summary of how we're going to build. Oh, and of course, in terms of racial inequality, that means that somehow that has to be in our consciousness as we're doing this. So the example that I gave of Flint, here is a city, a community that has been abandoned to all but the poorest Black residents. So when we have a group of Baha'is that have moved into that particular community and are working to educate and uplift the children and junior youth, then that's race unity. But it also means that we ourselves in our friendships, in our community lives, in our organizations are building interracial relationships, that we're not letting ourselves and our communities be influenced by the rampant negativism and racial prejudice that exists right now, even now, and that we're working to overcome the institutional structures of racism that we see all around us. So that's, again, I'm so long. I'm sorry.
No. Thank you.
So much.
No, really, I think highlighting what you just said right now about not letting the negative forces of society impact our own thinking, that is so huge. And the example of Flint, for example, it could be hopeless to think all these structures had, and the abandonment, of the protections that every citizen should have, being absent, and that the interfaith work, the interracial work, all of the work that's done so that people can become the builders of their own material and spiritual development, right? This picture is what can happen in every single city in the United States.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
And it reminds me of this this beautiful reference that I learned about while in college. It's a West African Akan principle, and it's called Sankofa. And I'm sure you've heard of it before. But in order to progress forward, we've got to remember to stretch back. And it's almost like this theoretical bridge, so to say, to carry us over. And it can deeply enrich the transition by honoring the importance of understanding the existence of what happened in the past in order for us to inform and bring on present justice. And so that brings me to the next question. Most of your adult life has been spent teaching and writing about racial and social justice within the very specific professional field of urban planning, and in specific places such as post-industrial cities. Like I know you said you've done a lot of work in Detroit. Why were you motivated to approach these social justice topics in a field better known for physical or spatial arrangement of cities?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, first of all, I fell in love with cities. I just fell in love. I thought they were the coolest thing. So here we are in this small town in South Carolina. I mean, we couldn't go to the movie theater without sitting in the segregated balcony, couldn't get a hamburger and a milkshake, it was just like, oh. So we would go to cities, so we'd go to Atlanta, we'd go to my grandparents lived in Miami, And even once we went to New York City, to Harlem to see a long distance cousin, and there was freedom, you know. So I just had this association in my mind of cities and freedom. And so when I discovered, I think I was a junior or senior in college when I discovered this field of urban planning, and I actually realized at the same time that it was very flexible because it did have that some people were kind of focused on the physical land use or the physical design of cities, but I soon found out that there were whole branches of this field that looked at neighborhoods, that looked at community development, that looked at economic development. And that was, of course, the branch I fell in love with. Um, and also, I discovered that they had people who are interested in history and theory. We actually have an organization that's devoted to just history and theory in terms of urban planning. And so, of course, I hooked up with those people. So I was able to find my own niche within that field. But my beloved choice of a field, I discovered had flaws. You know, it's sort of like you find a really good friend or a sweetheart, and then you discover they have a fatal flaw, right? You know. So my beloved field had this fatal flaw. And the flaw was simply, it was kind of clueless in terms of racial justice and racial equality. There were a few people that understood the importance, but it had this negative mark on its reputation in cities like Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland because the urban planners had been used by the mayor and city council to clear out Black neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods and Italian neighborhoods. And the field didn't quite understand what had happened. One minute they're the saviors of of humanity and cities, and the next minute, you know, they're walking into a Black audience and people are booing, you know. So it was kind of clueless. So this was perfect for me because I could save them. So I know it sounds funny, but I that's what I was thinking. I was thinking, oh, I love cities and I like this field and they're kind of whacked, but I can help save them. And that's one of the reasons I went into graduate school for, you know, study of urban planning. And so my particular role turned out to be helping them to have a clearer understanding of racial justice, of social reform in terms of racial inequality. And I did that by just writing about it. One of the reasons I wrote about it was because there was no literature. So I walk into my first classroom. I was teaching at Michigan State University, and there were very few articles that could be used to actually show that there was something about cities in terms of racial justice that we should understand. And I think there might be some. Oh yeah, that's me talking. That's me having a good time talking to urban planning students at Georgia Tech University. You know, so um, you know that's kind of what I did. I had a chance to just kind of write about racial diversity, and it always helps to have diverse faculty so that when students came into the classroom, they could have someone who understood something about race and racial injustice. And so part of what I did was to work at writing material that could be helpful to understanding the situations we were in, and part was just to educate students to give them a better sense of social justice and racial justice needs in cities. So I better stop there. I'm rambling on, but
Never. So halfway between the civil rights era and now, you wrote two books, a co-edited book, Urban Planning and the African American Community in the Shadows and Redevelopment. And then you wrote another one, Redevelopment and Race, Planning a Finer City in Post-War Detroit. Why did you write these books, and how did your self-identity as a Baha'i influence them?
Yeah, so those are, if you were to ask an urban planning academic in this country, um, what if they know me or know my name, why, it would be because of one of these two books. So Redevelopment and Race, I wrote to document the history of the relationship between racial injustice and the field of urban planning in the city of Detroit. And so it's a history, it's a straight history. But it was informed by this need for social reform. And it was a pretty pressing need for social reform because I had married, my husband was a native of Detroit. I had a big in-law family in Detroit, and they were suffering because of some of the mistakes that were made by urban planning. They were also benefiting from some of the good steps that have been taken by urban planning. And so this book is a documentation of that. And when it came out in the 1970s, it was probably one of the first books to connect this idea of racial injustice and urban planning. So as a Baha'i, this idea of vocation, again, my vocation was in part to document for my chosen field the linkage between the field and the need for racial justice. But you can tell if you read the book, especially in the last few chapters, you can tell that I have a vision of what the city should be. So I can't help myself. So toward the end, I think it's the last chapter, I start talking about the character that urban planners should have and the kinds of associations, the kinds of communications they should forge with the people that they're planning for. So it is an attempt to create some link between a profession and the people that they serve. The urban planning in the African American community, by the way, both of these books are still in print. It's amazing to me. They're almost 30 years old, but people still use them. Urban planning in the African American community, especially like urban planning programs at HBCUs. But urban planning in the African American community was just a case of myself and my friend, a Jewish woman named Marcia Ritzdorf, who was also concerned about social reform, getting together, getting our friends together, and creating a compilation of articles about that same relationship between the African American community and urban planning. And I don't think there's been another book quite like it ever since. It was almost like a friendship project. She and I used to room together when we went to conferences, and we just dreamed up this book. And it turned out to be useful to some people. So that was very confirming.
So, about the same time, you wrote a book that barely mentioned race and racial inequality, Planning Progress Lessons from Shohi Effendi. This book was about a leader of faith, community who lived in Palestine. How did being an urban planning professor really like influence the writing of this book?
Well, I could only write it because I was actively seeking a role model for urban planning in the spiritual realm. So I was looking for someone that I could look up to, and um I was hard pressed to think of any role models in urban planning. But then someone asked me once to give a talk on Shoghi Effendi, who was the leader of the worldwide Baha'i community from early January 1922 until his death in 1957. And I realized that here was a spiritual leader who actually was a planner. He planned global plans for the worldwide community. And so it was such a joyful book to write because with some of the other books, they were kind of, me trying to explain race and racial inequality. With this particular book, it was just pure who was Shoghi Effendi and how did he plan? What techniques did he use? As it happened, I was at that point teaching planning history and theory. That's what one of my courses covered. And so it was easy to see that the people I was looking at in my field, I wanted to see how do you actually make a good plan? How do you motivate people to carry out audacious goals? He was right there all along, Shoghi Effendi. All I had to do was examine him and his letters, and I could understand much deeper than I ever thought I could by looking at my professional literature. So this is, of all my books, this is absolutely my most favorite. Well, don't tell any publishers that, but this is clearly my most favorite. I was at my best um, writing this book just because he was such an incredible person, and writing this allowed me to immerse myself for pretty close to 4 years in just studying Shoghi Effendi and his planning style. It allowed me to release a little bit, my lifelong um, burden of explaining race to people. After a while, you need a break. And so this allowed me to gave me a little bit of a break to just kind of just write something that was really inspirational and that I really enjoyed.
Thank you so much. I know that we can continue to ask many, many questions and listen all night. We're almost at the end of our time, so I thought I would choose two of the questions that have been posted in the Q&A. One of them is something that many in the Black community find to be frustrating is the notion of white allies who ask people of color what they should do and how they should help this cause of racial unity. On one side, people of color feel that white allies are not taking ownership of their part of eradicating racism from our society. On the other hand, white allies may not want to come off as trying to be white saviors. What are your thoughts and insights on this?
Yeah, well, I think, people have a responsibility for addressing issues of racial prejudice no matter where they live. And I don't think that anyone should feel that it's necessary to go to somebody else in some other neighborhood and ask, what can I do? Because there's plenty of work to be done wherever one lives, even if just to educate one's peers. So I think that's the first point, that everyone has a responsibility and people shouldn't feel that they shouldn't place the burden on their Black friends to make that definition for them. Having said that, I will also say that particularly in this last book, the one about South Carolina, one of the things that I discovered that I hadn't expected to discover about that civil rights period in South Carolina was there really were white allies, but they weren't self-proclaimed allies. They were people that essentially gave up their privilege and their station in the white society. And sometimes they lost their jobs, they lost their friends in order to associate with Black people. The most famous of them is Judge J. Watis Waring, who is the man who essentially created the dissent that was used by the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education. He was an aristocratic Charlestonian who was ostracized by his white aristocratic friends when he chose to associate with Black people such as Septima Clark, who was that civil rights leader. So I would call those true allies. And those people put their lives on the line. They put their careers on the line, their reputations on the line. So I would be careful. Other people should be careful with naming themselves white allies, because true white allies in American history paid the price, and it was often a steep price.
Thank you so much. Our last question. In the face of increasing current legislative and judicial rollbacks of hard-won civil rights laws, what strategies, spiritual and societal, can prove effects towards promoting racial justice now?
Yeah, I think this is what we're all trying to figure out. And I just, first of all, we kind of have to live through this without clear answers. At this point, we have to kind of roll with the waves. The waves are like stormy waves, 10 feet, 15 feet high. But we kind of have to roll with them and figure out what are the strategies right now for survival. And, quite frankly, in my opinion, Black people have always been good at riding through the storm. We've always figured out some way to ride through the storm, because we've been through lots of storms. And it's that countervailing forces concept again. It looks like things are looking up, and then they're not looking up. So, for example, there are certain offices, certain diversity efforts that have been eliminated on my own campus, the University of Michigan. But people are finding other ways. People are moving resources around and renaming initiatives and doing all kinds of things to kind of ride through the storm. And that's not the best solution. Of course, we wish that things could change from the top, but sometimes you just have to kind of like roll with the punches. But I think, again, this idea of looking at social transformation as something that can happen at the individual, the family, the community level is one way to make ourselves not feel totally disempowered. We do have power within certain limitations, but it may just take a while to figure out what's the next path forward. That's the best I can say right now. I think we're all thinking about these things and figuring out what do we do about these things.
But I mean, I think that what you've presented so graciously to us tonight in this webinar, your lived experience of being a teenager and literally having the courage to do what was necessary in the face of great oppression. And so it's abundantly clear what needs to be done. We need to have that same courage. We need to continue to build from the examples, that you have shared with us. There's one thing that you said in the class when you presented about, I'm obsessed with that one middle school student. So I don't know if we could have the picture up again, but when you were all standing there,
The Warriors, the Orangeburg School Warriors picture.
yes, the Orangeburg School Warriors, that there was one young lady who was alone, that some of you were in high school together, desegregating, but she and her brother in elementary were alone. And Asia, I think it was you in the class who had asked, like, what emotional impact did that have? And I don't know if you wanted to just point her out.
Yeah. So she's standing next to me, and she's a little shorter than me. So she's yes, this is Pat. So most of the girls that you see, and Tyrone, who's on the right, um, most of us were high schoolers, but Pat was in junior high by herself. and weathered a lot of verbal and physical abuse by herself. And I stayed friends with her for many years. It would be occasional visits when we went back to South Carolina because of course we were living in Michigan. And one of the things I said to the class was that the high schooler, the people that you're looking at, we fared differently from that experience. And Pat did not fare well. She 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 remained embittered for the rest of her natural life, and she died an early death. So I think, and I know this because I would see her 20, 30, 40 years later, and she would say things like, well, do you remember so-and-so did such and such to me? And or she would tell me things that were done to me that she said, don't you remember so-and-so pushed you and did such a, I'd long set aside because, one of my strategies was to selectively remember and forget a lot of stuff. But she remembered all the slights, and it's just I think it's kind of a sad story, but it kind of reminds us that we have to have the fortitude to weather trials and tribulations without letting them destroy us. I'm thinking, for example, there's the son of Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha, pointed out, he would be in prison. He was imprisoned for because of his beliefs for years, and he said he was happy, even so, because we have to protect our spiritual health and we have to protect our emotional health. And nothing I could say to her would would be enough to make her not quite so bitter. So I think she was in her 60s, 50s or 60s when she died in a nursing home after a very hard life.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
what a courageous soul. She would
Yeah.
come home with chewing gum in her hair, and unlike some of us, some of us would just take it, you know, but she would talk back. you know, Somebody would call her in this and in that, whatever, and she would call them a whole bunch of names I didn't know a young lady knew. So, but it ate at her. So, sometimes we just have to go with the flow and protect ourselves
Mm,
and and um and be aware that there are injustices in the world that we cannot let defeat our spirits. Our human spirits are precious, and we have to guard our human spirits. And that was a great example for me. God bless her soul.
mhm, mhm. I often think of her now from the stories that you've shared. And thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences. I think you had said in the class when you were asked, what gave you guys the courage at that age to do such a thing? And you said we were our parents' only hope.
We were our parents' only hope. Yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was up to us. If we
Mm,
hadn't forced the issue, the schools were going to continue to block our progress because
mm,
the Black schools were inferior and the graduate schools were closed.
mhm, mm,
Nobody could have advanced.
mhm,
So even though everything kind of resegregated, it was a noble cause, and I don't regret being a part of it.
mhm. And I know that everyone listening thanks you for that. Of course, in the Q&A, there is so much appreciation as well.
Mm.
And you spoke of Shoghi Effendi, and I'll end with this. I know you don't have time. Hopefully, you'll come back for another webinar to talk about the role of whites and blacks and all of the things that Shoghi Effendi wrote about in the advent of divine justice.
Yeah.
One of which we ended on hope, the need for hope, and how all of the central figures in the Baha'i faith talk about humanity having a glorious destiny.
Yes.
And that we will come to our full maturity. We will see unity and diversity and the oneness of humankind manifested in all the realms of society. But we have to work towards that, and we have to build the kingdom of God here on earth. And
Absolutely.
it seems like the way our spiritual muscles grow is through the process that Shoaib Effendi talked about, disintegration. Sorry. The process of disintegration gives way to the process of integration.
Integration. Absolutely.
So
Yes. Yes.
that's what we'll keep striving for. And Asia, thank you for being such a wonderful
Thank you,
co-host. And
Asia.
Dr. Thomas, thank you so much for being here with us tonight and sharing all that you did. And all of those who are with us listening in on a Friday night, thank you so much. We look forward to the next one with all of you. Thank you and good night.
Good night.